Hello, everyone. We will be talking about doing rebuttals mostly for the next couple of slideshows. Basically, giving you some ways that you can challenge the arguments of the other side and the rebuttals and argue that your side has done a better job in the debate. For these, first of all, we're going to talk about arguing credibility. That's the question of how good are your sources? Are they credible or are they biased? Do you have the balance of good sources on your side? And in the rebuttal, you can argue that we've won the debate because we presented more credible evidence, or because the balance of the sources, the credible sources, tend to be on your side. So I'm going to give you some ways to specifically challenge the credibility of the other team's arguments, as well as questions you can ask, whether during cross-examination or kind of asking yourself to determine whether their arguments and their sources are indeed credible. This is an essential skill today for a couple of reasons. One is, first of all, we have so much information out there. There are sources on pretty much any topic that you can find, that it becomes really essential for you, not only in these debates, but also in your everyday life, to be able to determine whether the sources that you're listening to are truly credible or whether they're biased. Many of those those sources that are out there are not trustworthy sources because they are representing a cause of some kind. They're trying to make money or advance a political cause or something like that. So, in this day and age with so much information, sorting through that information is even more important skill. The second reason is this tendency we have, I think, in particular because of social media and the internet, and because there is so much information, to get caught up in what's called confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is where we only look for information that confirms our prior beliefs. And it results in what a lot of people call echo chambers. That is, where we live in these information environments where we only listen to information that we already agree with, or that agrees with our quote unquote side. Obviously, that is not the sign of an intelligent person. Anyone who is intelligent will consider both sides of an issue and consider all of the research out there, and won't just rush to, only look for information that agrees with them, but will fully consider both sides of a topic. That's part of why we are doing switch side debating, so that we can fully consider both sides of a topic and come to our best decisions given the information on both sides. So try to avoid confirmation bias, and try to, whenever you see information presented on the internet, determine whether that information is indeed credible. So there's a kind of a hierarchy and different types of sources, and you should prefer the ones that are higher in this hierarchy than other kinds of sources, because these sources tend to be less biased. First of all, are what are called primary sources. They're primary because they're the sources that develop the data or do the studies themselves. These will typically come from academic sources or scholarly sources. A lot of those will either be published in a journal that's a scholarly journal, or published in a peer review book, or have .edu on the website. It's a primary source when they are doing the study themselves rather than talking about a study that someone else has done. The same thing with government studies, data, and reports. Typically, these will have a .org, like FBI.org or DHS.org for Department of Homeland Security. And these, the government also hires scholars in their bureaucracies. I'm not talking about politicians here, right? I'm talking about people who work for instance, the EPA or the FBI, right? They do primary research into, like, for instance, how much crime or violent crime there is, how many police shootings there might be, And so those are primary sources. And because those bureaucracies tend to employ scholars to do these studies, they're also highly trustworthy sources. Another type of primary source is a think tank. Think tanks are a lot like scholarly sources. That is that they hire experts to do research into a position. These will typically have .org next to them. And they usually call themselves institutes. So things like the Cato Institute or the Brookings Institute or the Rand Institute or the Heritage Foundation are what are called think tanks. Now, think tanks tend to hire experts and tend to have credible and primary sources. They do their own studies, they gather their own statistics, etc. But you should be a little leery of think tanks because some of them are funded by biased sources. For instance, some think tanks about climate change are funded by the fossil fuel industry. So when in doubt, always Google the organization or the institution and find out, where are they getting their funding from? How trustworthy is this organization or institution? But nonetheless, these are primary sources that tend to do their own research. Now, secondary sources, again, there's sort of a hierarchy here. Secondary sources are sources that are taking primary sources or data and offering their own either opinion or research based off of that data. This includes news reporting as well as opinion pieces. And this is an important distinction to know the difference between when you're out there looking at sources. News reporting, if for journalistic sources, will present the who, what, when, where, and why, but not offer a kind of analysis or their own opinion about what that all means, right? Whereas, and so you'll typically find that kind of reporting, labeled separately than opinion pieces. In an official news organization, say the New York Times or the Washington Post, they will label, which of these is news reporting, which is more trustworthy, and which of these are opinion pieces, which can be trustworthy but depend on the qualifications of the author and the credibility of the data that author is using. It's their opinion, it's not necessarily accepted fact. Now, why do I put news reporting at the top of these secondary sources? You might know that most journalistic organizations, most official news organizations, do, like academic studies, do what's called peer review or editorial review, where they double check the sources. They make sure that the data is being used is accurate. They make sure that the quotes that are being used are accurate, and those kinds of things. Whereas with opinion pieces, maybe that same type of double check is not being done. So you should always be suspicious if there's no label of, that this is an opinion piece. You should also be suspicious of sources that look official, but that never do their own news reporting, that they only offer opinion pieces. So then this includes things like blogs or non-institutional sources. So they're not working for an official organization. There's a lot of these that have popped up, things like the Daily Caller and the Daily Beast, which don't have extensive fact-checking and don't have extensive editorial review. And so, these are just sort of glorified blogs, things like also like Huffington Post, for instance. And while you can use those sources, I think they're lower on the hierarchy of sources and should be questioned, even more. And then obviously memes and unknown sources. This is a problem, that we see circulating on our social media. You'll see something like this, and a couple of tips here that should clue you into why this isn't a very credible source. First of all, the source, Crime Statistics Bureau, San Francisco. What is that even? What's the specific website? That information isn't just published like that by whatever the Crime Statistics Bureau of San Francisco is. Also, obviously this is only San Francisco. And we have this sort of very emotionally loaded image here, right, that should make you question these things. If they don't have a specific author or a specific hyperlink to where that source came from, then you should be really suspicious of it, right? Just saying a name of a source doesn't make something credible. And just because your friend shared it on Facebook or your family member does not make it credible either. A key element that can come up and you can raise in your debates and also for credibility of your source is the qualifications of the source. It's basically a question of who is the author? What are their credentials? If this person doesn't have professional or academic credentials, then maybe they are a questionable source. Oftentimes, people will cite the opinion of journalists, and while journalists are professionals, they're not experts in the field that they're specifically offering their opinion about. So those sources can be questioned. You can also ask, what else has this author written? If they consistently write arguments that are in favor of sort of one side instead of another, then maybe that gives you an indication of the bias of the author. And for what audience does this author typically write? If they're typically writing for sort of a public audience, then maybe they're not really an expert in their field, because experts in their field tend to write sources for other experts and such. So these are things you can bring up in cross-examination, like who is this source, what are their credentials, questioning those kinds of things, and also questioning what the credibility of the institution that the author works for. Also, besides the author, you should ask who is the publisher of this source. What company, journal, or website published the source? Again, academic sources are to be preferred because academic sources have peer review. That is, other experts review the publication before it gets published, and are a good check on anything that would be too biased or too outlandish. If an entity typically publishes information only from one side, then excuse me again. Then that maybe will be less trustworthy. For instance, things that you see on like Breitbart or for the right, or Daily Chaos for the left. These are entities that only ever publish arguments or opinion pieces in favor of the right or the left. And in that case, they're less trustworthy because they sort of determine what side they were going to come down on before they even publish the piece. That's something that's different with official studies and academic studies, where academic studies are done without knowledge of what the results will be before they start gathering the data. You should also ask who owns, runs, or helps run the entity. That is, who funds this source, who runs this entity. What is this entity's editorial or review policies? If they don't have information about how they review the information that they publish, then they're not very trustworthy, right? There's a couple of sources that you can use online that help you check some of this bias and some of this source qualification. One's called SourceWatch, which will often tell you who runs the entity, who owns it, where they're getting their funding from, etc. And then Media Bias Fact Check, which is one that just sort of rates it on kind of a right-left scale and how extreme their framing is. And you can check that out as well. So there's some clues that you can look into to determine the credibility or accuracy of the research. If the publication doesn't cite other research, then that's a clue that maybe it's not credible. Oftentimes, in a lot of these sort of like faux news organizations, you'll hear people say things like, the evidence is highly against the idea of racism policing, or the evidence clearly shows, but they won't cite that evidence. What evidence are they talking about, right? What data are they talking about? if there aren't footnotes, if there aren't hyperlinks to other studies and research, then you should be highly suspicious of that. And in fact, if the other team, brings evidence up that says there's research that says dot dot dot, you should ask them what research. If they don't know what that research is, then that's a really good way to challenge the credibility or accuracy of their sources. Another clue is if their site only publishes arguments from one perspective. I know President Trump has attacked what he calls the fake news media, and there's a lot of arguments on the right about how the news media is biased. And while that might be true for their opinion pieces, that is not often true for their objective reporting. If you look at the New York Times or the Washington Post or the LA Times or the USA Today, they have done reporting that reflects negatively on the Obama administration, on Hillary Clinton during the 2016 election and her treatment of emails, etc. Even their opinion pieces will oftentimes have conservative opinion writers. So you can trust the news reporting of those more factual organizations, even if they do have a little bit of a liberal bias, because they will publish arguments that are critical of or being watchdogs of Democratic administrations as well. But if you go on a website and all you ever see is criticisms of Trump and never any support, never any criticisms of Democrats or liberals, then that's something that maybe is not as trustworthy. Do they have and clearly state a research methodology, right? That's one way to determine that this is just an opinion piece. We can ask, well, how did they come to this conclusion? How did they do their research? This is a good way to question the credibility of the other side's arguments in a debate as well, right? If they say studies say ... you can say, well, how was that study done? How many people did they survey? How many states did they look at? How many cities did they look at? And obviously, if there's not an answer to that question, or the authors never really say how they did that, then you might want to. That might be a reason to question their research, their credibility as well, right? Obviously, someone who isn't offering very credible information doesn't want you to look into how they did their research. That's another reason that we prefer academic or scholarly sources, because they will clearly state how they did their research. You can also challenge a research methodology, right? I was debating with someone on social media the other day, and they were citing a source about masks not working with coronavirus. And the study that they were citing had only done a study of 30 nurses at one hospital. That's one way to really question the credibility of that source or the accuracy of that source. Only 30 people doesn't seem like nearly enough to trust that source. This is a real key clue to credibility. If they use inflammatory terms or sort of misleading framing, then that's a clue that this is probably not a credible source. You won't see very often in scholarly sources or in official studies words like evil or liars or anarchists or socialists or radicals or things like that. And when you see terms like that, you should immediately be suspicious, right? That kind of inflammatory or loaded language is designed to get an emotional reaction out of you and to get you to sort of turn off your rational brain, to not ask questions about, well, where did this evidence come from? Also, is the source attempting objectivity, right? If a source is presenting factual information only, saying, here's what happened, here's the data, then that's probably a more trustworthy source. If a source instead is saying, because of this data, that means this is true or that is true, then that kind of evidence should be you should be more suspicious of that kind of evidence. And then the last one here, and I think this is a really important one, is the argument or data confirmed by other sources. That is, when you find evidence in a source, be sure to Google it or look it up. Are there other sources that are confirming this same data? Or is this the only place that you can find this same data? There's some memes going around about some celebrities being involved in a pedophilia ring. And really, the only place you can find that information is in those memes. And when you Google it, you'll quickly find fact checks that say those memes are not true, and you'll find other sources that deny those sources. It's really important, especially in science and in the scholarly world, that you build on what's called accepted knowledge or the consensus of experts. And so, you can find, for instance, a scientist or two who deny that climate change is human caused and a really big problem. But 98% or more of scientists agree that it is happening. And that's an argument you can make in your data, in your debates, right? You can say, hey, look, almost every study done on this factor shows that maybe there's disproportionate arrests of people of color, and then that sort of argument, that consensus, that plethora of studies helps illustrate that you're more likely to have the more credible information. I just wanted to share one meme I saw that's sort of a good example of inflammatory framing. Excuse me. It says, how many cops have to die before Black Lives Matter is considered a terrorist organization? Obviously, this sort of conflates every cop who dies with the idea that Black Lives Matter did that. And certainly that's some suspicious framing because, there's no evidence here for that. Also, not every cop who dies is killed by an activist, much less a Black Lives Matter activist. Also, the organization Black Lives Matter itself is different than a person who says on Facebook, Black Lives Matter, right? So somebody might say on Twitter, Black Lives Matter, and then go on and kill a cop later on. But that doesn't mean that they're an official member of that organization, right? So here we have some very suspicious and inflammatory framing that you should be suspicious of anytime you sort of see loaded words like terrorism and death and stuff like that, because those things are trying to get an emotional reaction out of you. So in short, in these debates, I really encourage you to question the sources of the other side. If you can do a good job in the rebuttals of questioning their sources and showing how your sources are credible, then you can go a long way to proving, excuse me, I don't know what's going on. You can go a long way to proving to winning the debate, right? If in that rebuttal you can say, look, they've only offered one source for this, and it comes from a journalist, not from a scholar. We have had, we have shown that there are many scholars who disagree with that data. We have shown why our scholars have research methods that they spell out, that they cite other research, and none of that is being done by the other side. Then you'll go a long way to winning that debate. So happy debating. Our debates are just right around the corner. And please let me know if you have any questions, and have a great day.